I work for a security firm, a very professional one. We aren't like Blackwater or any of those other mercenary bands, but we have our share of ex-military and law enforcement, even a few combat vets. We're thoroughly trained and, depending on the contract, considerably well-armed. A few months ago, I was assigned to a nondescript building on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia. We operate all along the East Coast. We didn't receive any details on what or who we were securing. That's how I knew it was a government job. Private contractors usually get hired when the government wants to keep something under wraps. Half a dozen guys in generic black clothing draw a lot less attention than fully uniformed military. We were better trained than 80% of them anyway. Patrol patterns, access controls, and screenings were what we were responsible for. The building was large. It seemed like a repurposed hospital, but updated. The property was expensive, but it had an 8-foot-high chain-link fence, and the grounds were under constant CCTV surveillance. We didn't find any of this the least bit odd. Pretty common practice, really, in this line of work. There was a roster of about 30 personnel who routinely worked in the building. I recognized all of them and knew a few well enough to have brief conversations, but it was always idle chit-chat. None of them ever revealed any information about the site, and I never asked. Until recently, we had hardly received any visitors, the odd official or medical personnel. But now, well over the last 2 weeks, it's been steady, from military higher-ups, doctors, and various government agencies. I was typically on perimeter patrol and preferred it that way. Fresh air, no matter how cold, always kept me on my toes. And that's what I was doing the night it happened. The building had been a buzz of activity all day, record number of visitors, and the first time I had seen military vehicles so overtly enter the grounds. We had gotten word earlier that the contract was coming to an end, and I was going to be reassigned somewhere in Philadelphia. Rumors about the police force was they were bringing us on for some extra muscle. The building had wound down at this point, with only a skeleton crew of 5 or 6 left inside, plus 9 other security personnel. They had doubled us up over the last few days. It was about 10:30 at night. I only had another 90 minutes on shift. I was on the eastern edge of the grounds, doing a routine check of the fence line when my walkie blared out into the silence. All security was being called to the main entry room. The voice spoke frantically, and I couldn't make out who was speaking. I started trotting towards the front of the building when I heard an alarm start blaring inside. Sounded like a fire alarm. I double-timed it and could see another guard running from the west edge of the perimeter. Right before I reached the door, it flew open, and 2 women wearing lab coats burst through the entryway, running down the steps right past me. They didn't stop to talk. The other guard caught up to me, and together we moved into the building. Multiple alarms were going off all inside the building, and the overhead sprinkler system had been set off, water pouring down on the tops of our heads. We made our way to the entry point and linked up with 5 of our guys. 3 were missing. None of us knew what was going on, and we were under strict orders not to cross past the entry point unless directed to do so by building personnel. 2 gunshots from the hallway past the door were followed by a scream of pain, which was cut short abruptly. Order or not, this is what we were here for, and we moved into the hallway, leaving 1 man back to guard the door. The hallway was clean and sterile, like you would see in an intensive care ward. We were unfamiliar with this part of the building, and when we came to a junction, we split into 2 groups. I took the north corridor with 2 other guards, and we made our way down the hallway, meticulously checking each room. Most were empty, but I have had what looked like medical equipment stored neatly on shelves or covered by tarps. As we neared the end of the hallway and came upon a set of double doors that crashed open, slamming into the walls beside, a body came soaring down the hallway, slamming into the guard next to me. I raised my AR to the doorway in response, but nothing trained me for what came barreling through. Calling them human would be a stretch, but 3 of them came crashing through the door after the body. Each was 9 feet tall with gray-green skin. They were completely nude but bore no signs of gender. Their bodies were lean, and a maze of veins ran along each of their limbs. They had human faces, but were devoid of any type of hair. One of the three had a tangle of tubes and wires trailing behind him, the other two riddled with scars and gaping holes on their torsos. As soon as they saw us, they rushed. I was able to get a single shot off and watched it soar through the chest of the first one. It didn't even break stride. The last thing I remember was my head slamming into the hallway wall. I woke up on a military base about 30 miles from where we had been. I immediately knew I was concussed and I couldn't stand. It was a long time before anyone came to see me, and when they did, it wasn't the least bit enlightening. There was no explanation as to what I saw or what those things were. Nobody would even formally acknowledge that I had been engaged in any type of combat at all. I received fair medical treatment, but that's it. Eventually, one of my superiors from the firm came to see me and let me know that I was being placed on temporary leave until I recovered and could return to duty. After I got home, I tried reaching out to a few of the other contractors I knew, but still haven't been able to get in touch with any of them. Once this story gets out, I'm sure they'll know who blew the whistle. I don't know what will happen to me, and at this point, it doesn't really matter. We need to tell people what I saw. We need to let them know that the government is performing some kind of experiment, creating some kind of weapon. This happened in 2018 when I was camping with my family near Superior National Forest in Minnesota. We had camped near Superior National Forest before, a few times in fact. The last time was maybe 2 years before. We were going to meet up with my aunt and uncle, and they were bringing my cousins as well. We ended up packing too much in the car. It wasn't so bad at first, but after a couple of hours, we were feeling like sardines in a can. I've never been so happy as to see a campground in my life. We checked in and then drove to our site and started to set up our tents, unpack our gear, you know the drill. We were there an hour before my aunt and uncle found us. We grilled burgers that night, and I ate way too much. I decided I was going to go walk it off and found myself walking one of the many trails in the area. The brush was really green and slightly overgrown, apparently from a wildfire a few years before. Everything kind of grows crazy afterwards, according to the rangers. There wasn't too many other people walking the trail. I wasn't really paying attention, just enjoying the surroundings and the quiet of the woods. At one point, I thought I heard something in the breeze, like a really light whispering of words. I kept walking for about 20 minutes and heard something again. This time I stopped and stood still, trying to listen. I looked around, trying to see if there was someone else around on the trail, but it seemed like I was alone. I noticed that it was quiet. I didn't hear any birds or see anything moving around, and then I heard it again. It sounded like light whispering around me. I looked around me again. There wasn't a soul around me. I heard the whispering get louder, but it was weird. It wasn't really words, but it sounded like sentences being formed. I looked around, and that's when I first saw it, a pale light off in the distance. I began to walk down the trail slowly, getting closer to where it was. When I got to about 20 feet or so, it blinked out, and I heard the whispering again. I didn't know what to think. I just stood there, looking around me. Another light in the shape of an orb then appeared about 30 feet from where I was standing. Then another about 20 feet from me off to my left. I tried walking left, and the light blinked out. I turned to try and walk up to the second light, but it suddenly blinked out. Now I'm starting to sweat and get goosebumps. When I began to hear the whispering again, and it seemed to get louder and louder in my ear, that was it. I turned around and started walking the way I came. When another orb appeared to the right of me, I started to run, and I swear 2 or 3 more appeared in the corner of my eyes as I ran down the trail. I didn't get far. I was running maybe 10 or 15 minutes before I ran into a couple on the trail. I guess I looked kinda crazy, because the looks they gave me spoke volumes. I stopped and watched them walk off down the trail, and I just waited to see them running back towards me. They never did. I walked a bit down the trail, and I saw them, but I didn't see any lights or hear any of the whispering. I just kind of stood there dumbfounded, wondering what the hell just happened. I decided just to walk back to my campsite. I don't know what happened or what I experienced in those woods. I walked back to camp and sat down with my family and just acted like nothing happened. I brought them to the same trail the next day. We walked the whole thing and nothing happened. I ended up going back by myself after that, but nothing happened. No light orbs, no whispering, nothing. We haven't been back there since, but I always wonder about those woods and what I saw on that trail. This is a crazy story that was told to me by my friend Karen. Both her and I live about 45 minutes northwest of Atlanta, Georgia in Cartersville. The encounter occurred the night of Wednesday, May 15th, 2019, while she was on her way home from work from the job that she'd been working at for over 30 years. School secretary at the local high school. That day she had put in a long day and ended up staying a bit later than usual to catch up on some paperwork. She hadn't wanted to do it, but the administration was coming down hard on her, and so she just bit the bullet and stayed that day until it was finished. And now, she was very much looking forward to getting home to her husband and dog and putting her feet up, hoping to avoid the headache that she could feel was coming on. About 10 minutes into her drive home along Center Road, she was finally east of Route 75 and driving the final stretch to her house. She and her husband chose their house when they were first married because of its location, only a few miles to town, but also a bit in nature, as evidenced by McCaskey Creek Campground being right down the road. However, at this point, she couldn't help but think about how this last bit of the drive always made her nervous. It was notorious with the neighbors for being a spot where animals roamed and wandered into the road. She had even hit a deer there herself a few years back, and she could name off at least 6 other people she knew who had also hit deer on that stretch of the road. Sure enough, as Karen drove down the road, she noticed an unusual movement out of the corner of her eye, back off the road a bit. She knew this road like the back of her hand and could easily notice anything out of the ordinary. Her reflexes had reacted to the sight of a large animal flying from up along the side of her car and landing directly in the middle of the road in front of her, directly in the line of her headlights. She immediately slammed on her brakes, but was so close to the thing at this point that she thought for sure that she was going to slam into it, and she braced for the impact. And then, like a movie in slow motion, she watched as her car came to a sliding stop, skidding sideways down the road and towards the creature, watching as it threw its arms up in the air and jumped backwards to avoid being hit. Within seconds, she came to a stop, and there she sat in her car that was now sitting sideways in the middle of the road. All she could do was grip the steering wheel and watch as this creature. It turned its head away from looking at her and walked on 2 legs, making its way back to the side of the road, back in the direction that it had come from. Her headlights had clearly illuminated its grotesque features. They were somewhere between that of a man and a wolf. She estimates that it was easily the size of a large bear, but that its head was disproportionately large in comparison to its body, and she described the snout as long and almost sharp-looking. The fur on its back was black except along its spine, where it was a bit of a lighter brown color, and the fur on its chest and belly was lighter still, and it had a tail that looked like it was covered in fur, but Karen couldn't see very well once it left her headlights and then started to doubt that feature. But she said that the most startling thing about this creature was its eyes. They were bright, almost electric, and seemed to reflect her headlights in a way that looked like they glowed in the dark. Karen sat there staring at it as it made its way back into the darkness, and only when it completely disappeared did she finally release the breath she had been holding. The encounter lasted all of about 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity to Karen. And then, in a move that she still doesn't understand and second guesses to this day, she slowly drove her car off the road, off to the side, and got out. She then walked over to the area where the creature disappeared and looked around for any clues as to what it could have been. In retrospect, she feels she needed some sort of closure to come to terms with what had just happened. But she says it was almost like an out-of-body experience in that her brain wasn't really controlling her actions. She felt like it was instinct or some other force pulling at her. But there was nothing there. Nothing at all in the entire area that looked out of place except for the skid marks her car made back on the road. After a bit, she decided to give up on trying to figure out what it was and started walking back to her car. She turned her back to the trees and faced her car, and that's when she heard it, the sound of twigs snapping in the trees behind her. She spun around, her heart racing, saw nothing but knew she had to get out of there fast. She then tried to make a run for it back to her car, but before she could take more than 2 steps, there it was. The creature was standing right there in front of her again. This time, it didn't jump backward like before when her car came at it. It just stood there, looking at her with those unnerving eyes. And then, the thing happened that still haunts her to this day. She heard words in her head as if it had spoken to her. She remembers hearing a voice telling her to leave and never come back. Karen was rooted in place, stuck to the ground with a combination of fear and confusion rushing through her head. She couldn't understand how the creature could get in her head like that. Its voice was so unexpected that it took her a minute to even realize that she should be afraid. Eventually, fear and adrenaline kicked in, and she tried to run for her car again but found herself tripping over her own feet and landing hard on the grass before getting anywhere. The creature seemed to be drawn to her laying there, and it walked over to her. It was right next to her. She didn't dare look up at it. Instead, she kept her head down and her eyes looking at its feet that were rough and calloused in a way that only a wild animal would look. And then, as she was processing all this, the creature leaned down so that its face was only inches away from her face. She could hear it breathing slowly and deeply, and watched as the drool dripping from its mouth and landed on the ground next to its feet, and she could smell it too. The smell of death and rotting flesh. She closed her eyes and started to pray, but before she could utter a single word, she blacked out. To this day, Karen has never been able to recall how she got there or give a clear description of what happened after blacking out. She only remembers waking up in her car and finding herself sitting in the driver's seat. The first thing she did was check herself for injuries, and thankfully, all she saw were the few cuts from tripping and falling. She looked in the mirror, and her face was pale, and her eyes were black from her mascara streaming down her face. But luckily, she hadn't been harmed at all, and after looking at the clock, she determined that she had only been out of it for about 15 minutes. Her body and hands were still shaking uncontrollably, but she knew she needed to get out of there. When she was finally able to get her body under control, she started the car and pulled off onto the road and continued on her way home. While driving, she literally couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, and it made her feel so uneasy that she had to pull over a few times just to calm down. She would sit and take at least a dozen deep breaths before pulling it together enough to continue. Although it was terrifying to stop the car, she had no choice because the alternative would have surely ended with her wrecking the car. By the time she made it home, she had convinced herself that the entire thing was just a dream and that she had hallucinated the creature. There is just no way this had happened, she thought. The truth just didn't make any sense. She didn't even want to tell her husband for fear that he wouldn't believe her, and she would look like even more of a lunatic. But in the end, she really had no choice. because as soon as he saw her walk through the door, he jumped up and rushed over to see what had happened. It was beyond obvious that something was up. Karen knew right then that she needed to tell him the entire truth and get his opinion on what she should do. When Karen finally summoned the courage to talk about what happened, he looked at her with a seriousness that made her regret ever telling him in the first place. She was sure he was now concerned about her mental health, but instead he said that he did believe her and that he had an idea of what it maybe could be. He told her about a creature that he had heard of as a boy that was known as a Mothman. He told her that it was a creature that was seen throughout the Appalachian Mountains and that it was known to be very aggressive. It usually preyed on small animals, but there have been cases where it has attacked people as well. Well, that was a creature that Karen had never heard of before, but after hearing about it, she figured that it was possible, that is what she saw. Together, they chose not to tell anyone else about the incident for fear of being ridiculed and laughed at. They didn't even call the police. They both did some research online, and other possible creatures popped up on various websites. But her memory of it all was becoming more and more unsteady, almost like the memories of scary stories you heard as a kid. Or the memories of scary experiences. They're there, but you wonder if your brain embellished parts and made them worse than they really were. One thing that has definitely changed, though, is that after decades of driving that road to work, she now takes a different route altogether. She can't even get near the area without starting to violently shake. The story I'm sharing with you here took place in North Carolina in 2021. However, I am currently living in West Virginia. The weekend in question, or rather, the weekend this happened, I had headed south to an area in the vicinity of the Great Smoky Mountains for a solo camping trip. Stuff was happening for me personally at this time in my life, and I needed to be alone to get away from some things and clear my head. Also, I seriously needed the fresh air after being basically cooped up the last 2 years or so. So, I drove down Friday night and had an uneventful first evening setting up camp, and then headed to bed early. I got up early the next morning and didn't waste any time heading out since I wanted to beat most of the midday heat of summer. All was good for a while until I was hiking up a steep trail and huffing and puffing. When I stopped to catch my breath, I saw an off-leash dog way off in the distance. At first, it didn't even really register with me, but it was coming my way, and as it got closer, I became aware of how much larger it was than dogs usually are, and how it was moving along using only its back legs. It had reddish-brown fur and was massive, easily the size of a bear, but by the way it was standing, I was totally confused. I looked around to see if anyone else was on the trail, but I was the only one. It was just me and this creature, standing on this mountain trail in the middle of nature. Nobody, no help anywhere in sight. The fear started to set in as I began to fully understand the seriousness, that this could be a dangerous situation. I didn't know what this creature was, and I had no idea if it would attack me. Thoughts started creeping into my mind of all the things that might possibly happen, but I stood my ground, and I didn't flinch, hoping that if I didn't make any movement, it would just go away. Now, don't think I was being brave by doing this. I actually couldn't have moved at all, even if I had wanted to, and soon it was right next to me. I remember thinking that this must be it. I was going to die, that it was going to kill me. But then it stopped just a few feet away and it simply looked at me. Well, stared at me is more like it. I was looking into its piercing eyes, and I swear it was talking to me with them. In that moment, I knew it could think, just like us. I just knew it. I could sense it. And also, now it didn't seem mad, just curious. Like the way a dog would come running up to you frantically and then just stop and look at you. I was out for my morning walk on a crisp April morning when I saw something strange in the distance. I instantly knew something wasn't right because I walked this path almost every day and knew it intimately. I squinted to bring it into better focus, but that didn't make sense. I wasn't sure what it was, but I also didn't want to get closer to find out, so I hid behind a tree and just watched it. The creature was definitely big and definitely hairy. It was also insane looking. I would say it almost had a mean look on its face, but it didn't seem to be doing anything harmful. It just stood there, looking around. I remember thinking that it was acting curious even though its face was horrid, and that I wasn't sure how to read into anything from its looks. And then the creature started sniffing around like it was trying to catch the scent of something, and after a few quick minutes, it turned its head in my direction and looked directly towards me. I pulled myself in tight and stood as straight as I could behind the tree, hoping to throw it off, hoping it wouldn't see me. But I next heard footsteps on the ground. Basically, twigs breaking and leaves moving about. I could also feel the heaviness of the creature as its legs hit the ground with each step. It was walking over to me. I was terrified. But then I heard it make a noise that sounded like a cross between a grunt and a moan. The noise wasn't exactly scary, but it was so confusing that the hair stood on my arms. Even still, I didn't want to lean outside of the protection of the tree to look and see. I just remained there, staying still and upright as much as possible. Next, I could feel the air turn warmer, and I heard the sounds of slow, heavy breathing, raspy breathing. I could tell that the creature was very close to me now, and now I couldn't stop myself, and I needed to see what I was up against. I slowly leaned sideways to try and look around the tree without exposing my body, and there, only 10 feet on the other side of the tree, was this thing, animal-like but man-like, and we looked at each other for what felt like forever. Its face is still seared in my memory, and I'll never forget looking into its eyes. And then it blinked, shook its head, turned around and walked away. I watched it go until it completely disappeared into the woods. I was dumbfounded. Maybe it was just curious and didn't find me to be anything to worry about. I stood there pondering that thought when I heard another noise. This time it was a weird, guttural noise. Different than the grunting and moaning I had just heard earlier. This noise sent an extra shiver down my spine. And just as I was thinking about it, I saw the same animal thing heading back towards me, lumbering directly towards where I was still standing. The creature slowly approached me, and now I was terrified because it was coming back. Did it change its mind about me? Was it now thinking I was a threat? But I didn't want to run away and spark it to chase me. I didn't know what to do. As the creature got closer, I could see its eyes again, the eyes that seemed to reflect a brain that could think and communicate, and it still looked curious, not angry or mad. So I stood there and waited to see what it would do. It came close, like within a few feet, and sniffed around at me with its big snout. Then it made the same weird noise again, and I almost wondered if it was trying to speak to me. After a few minutes of listening to it make these noises, but not reacting in any way, the creature seemed to get tired of me. It turned its head away as if looking off into the distance for something, and then it turned around and walked in the direction it was looking. This time it was gone for good. I never saw it again. But I will never forget those strange noises it made, and even more so, I'll never stop thinking about what it might have been trying to say to me. I am convinced that it came back to communicate, but I wasn't able to understand. Either way, it's all something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. And now, every time I hear a strange noise in the woods, I always wonder if it's the creature coming back and wanting to try to communicate again. To be honest, I really wish I had been able to understand it. I even have dreams where we were able to understand each other, and all it wanted to do was to learn why we're so scared of it.